Okay, so good afternoon. After a 1 hour rest, I think we can start with the final leg of today's conference. By the way, a very important message from upstairs. Even now there is plenty of food and refreshment, so whenever you feel too tired, you can go upstairs and help yourself once again, okay? Feel free, it's serious. Okay, and now we go to even more serious things, which is the life in Islamic State. As you know, we started with the situation over there at the beginning with the presentation of Professor Georges. And what he said, or actually I'm not sure whether he mentioned this today or whether he mentioned this to me last night, that we actually do not have too many hard facts, information about the life under Islamic State. But now I'm sure Mitchell will try to fill this information gap, and we will see how the life under Daesh is presented and how the local population tries to convey us the message from that territory. So, Mr. Belfer, welcome.
Thank you very much. First, I'm going to tell you, about 30 minutes ago, I started to feel as though I was nervous. And, I don't know, I was just sitting upstairs and I started to feel as though I was nervous. And I realized it's not nerves at all, but I've just overdosed on caffeine. And so please excuse me if I talk too fast. I'm trying, but it's like, I'm like a wind-up doll, but it's really like going into hyper mode. So I do apologize. I have consumed just too much caffeine. Before we go any further, and before I, have the grand disappointment of telling you that actually I'm not going to tell you very much about inside the Islamic State, because we're outside the Islamic State, and very few people who go in come back out to tell the story. But we'll get to that in just a minute. I would like very much to thank our Center of Middle Eastern Studies, Breta, who's organized a fantastic conference 3 years in a row. 4 years? Is it 4 years? 3 years. Okay, let's not fast forward too much. 3 years in a row, and speaking purely as head of the Department of International Relations and European Studies, it's always wonderful to see these amazing guests coming and contributing their piece to, I think, what is all in our interests. And our interest is not only to give an academic paper, it's not only to spit out information for ourselves, but I think that we're all on the same page in this room. And I think generally people in Europe and the United States and other parts of the world are working in some ways to understand and to comprehend what's going on in the Middle East generally, not just about ISIS, not only about the Iranian-Saudi confrontations, but also all kinds of different angles from society, anthropological points of view, economic points of view. And it's important that we're all on the same page, because ultimately I think that none of us are arms dealers and none of us are drug smugglers, for heroin and opium coming from Afghanistan through Iran. I'm assuming that, maybe I'm wrong, but because anything short of this, or anybody who's peddling either drugs or the religion and the sectarian kind of ideologies, everybody else somehow wants to see an end to the conflict. Now, we may disagree as to what the end is going to look like, but it's very important that young scholars, older scholars, scholars in between, somehow have an image and try to, understand what's going on in the Middle East. Now, I think that I've got a pretty tough job today, and my tough job is to almost wind down a conference. I don't have the luxury of being the last one where the drum roll can go and everybody can clap their hands. I'm kind of like in the position after lunch, everybody's stomachs are full, and everybody's mind is kind of going somewhere else. I feel a little bit like I'm a middle child struggling for a little bit of attention. Now, especially because the concepts that we're going to be looking at today and the things that I want to try to present to you today, that's what you wanted. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Oh, okay, so sorry to interrupt. But I think that actually the topics that are going to raise so many more questions than I think any of us right now would be able to answer. And I'm also dealing with a topic which is highly politicized. It's a topic which information is very often invented. It's not reliable at all, and as a result of this, it means that our policies have very often reflected a situation which is not actually true. And we've made a lot of blunders, and not just we as, I don't want to point fingers and say the Americans made blunders or Britain made blunders. The Arab countries have made blunders. Everybody's made blunders along the way, including, by the way, the Islamic State. And I think that their ultimate objective, and something which is increasingly becoming clear is not going to come true, is the birth of the Islamic State and the maturation of the Islamic State. And so when we talk about it, their objective was not just to kill people. It wasn't only about ethnic cleansing. They wanted to build an entity. And that entity is what we're going to be looking at a little bit today. Now, the title of my work has become a little bit of a misnomer, because what I wanted to do is look within the Islamic State. I came up with kind of lofty ideas, overzealous ideas about how to gather information. And I used, whatever contacts I had available to kind of, look into what life inside the Islamic State was. But it was very difficult. And so I'm going to limit my work to very basically unpacking the question about life inside the Islamic State more abstractly, in terms of looking at the ideology, looking at some of the personalities that are entering the Islamic State but not necessarily coming out, but also trying to anticipate what's going to come next. Because ultimately that's what policymakers should be trying to do, is not figure out necessarily the ingredients that went into it, although that's important, but also with the unraveling of the Islamic State, new questions and new challenges are going to emerge. And it becomes a matter of deep importance for any scholar to try to work on the solutions, not only kind of characterizing what the problem was. Now, of course, there's the requisite or starting points about what ISIS is, because very few people really understand or grasp the history of it. I don't want to take a big trip down memory lane and provide you with the big history of the group, its affiliates, the key personalities, but there are some things that need to be understood if we want to know what the Islamic State is. Firstly, there's been the declaration, as you know, of the Caliphate. Now, what the Islamic State is supposed to do is embody the Caliphate. And the Caliphate is essentially just rule through the Khalifas, the chosen ones, as opposed to something that we now know as a disparate Islam, where you have many centers, many kind of rulers of the Islamic community who are in some ways competing with each other over legitimacy of the Islamic community. But then you have another alternative model, which is the Iranian model, which is an imamate. And the imamate is essentially a theocracy in which, those who are following politics in the region would know, Ayatollah Khomeini, so the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, was declared as the imam. And once again, so not since biblical times or Quranic times, was there an imam, and now you're supposed to be creating an imamate, which is a totally separate thing within Islam. But in this way, the declaration of the Caliphate by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was meant to create a new line of just leaders. And justice is very important in all this, by the way, for the international Islamic community, and it wants to try to trace its lineage back to the life and times of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, it's so easy what happens in the popular discourses. We say ISIS is un-Islamic, and many people do dismiss ISIS off the bat as being un-Islamic. That is true. It is un-Islamic if you look at certain strands within Islam. But there is also a certain resonance in the manner in which they speak about the decline or the corruption of Islam and the things or the ways that would be needed to somehow resuscitate and return Islam and Muslims back kind of to their proper place, which accounts, by the way, for a great sympathy. Not necessarily, standing shoulder to shoulder with ISIS, but there is a great sympathy amongst many in the Islamic world from one side to the other. And it would be both irresponsible and foolish to neglect that. And especially here in Western Europe, or in Europe in general. There's this, they're not Muslims, but, we have to figure out that there is a degree of sympathy. After all, and it's something I wanted to talk about later, but I'll fast forward it, more than 13% of the of the Muslim population of Britain have said openly that they support the Islamic State. That's a huge number. You're talking about a population in Britain of about 5.6 million people, and 13% of them are supportive or believed to be supportive of ISIS. Now, the other argument, or one of the arguments behind establishing an Islamic State, is in relation to the way that Islamic territories, or what we can call a Muslim majority states, have developed over time. So a lot of the rise of ISIS has nothing to do with the West, by the way. It has a lot to do with what they see as an internal corruption within Islam. And so what they're arguing, and what the argument is against, are those countries which have gone the national route instead of going the political religious route that Islam is supposed to be developing for you. Now ISIS, of course, like all other Middle Eastern actors, suffer from the same disease. The disease is called SMS, which stands for Selective Memory Syndrome. And all of them basically with ISIS, they base their understanding of Islam on a series of somehow obscure textual interpretations, especially when you consider how many countries, like Muslim majority countries, have actually been very successful. Not least, of course, the Ottoman Empire, more than 400 years of, bringing Islam to many parts of the world, and, being a very successful empire, in fact. But you have others. You have Morocco, you have Tunisia, you have, for example, Bahrain. These are countries that have a deeper and longer heritage, not only based, for example, on, these are more pluralistic as well as vibrant countries. But if you go back and you start recreating your histories, like ISIS often does, these countries and the people who inhabit them are considered to be un-Islamic. The leaders of these places, of these kind of modern or moderate Islamic Muslim majority countries, their leaders are seen as being apostate. And for those of you who don't know, to be an apostate is, the equivalent of being an enemy of Islam. And it's one of the 4 principles that you can use in order to declare jihad. So, typically, and something that we always forget, through much of the Middle East and Middle Eastern countries, the front line, the first line, are those countries that are, like, for example, the Gulf countries or Iraq, where you have a Muslim government over a Muslim majority population, but your government is seen as being apostate. And these have been in the crosshairs of Islamists since basically time immemorial. Now, ISIS is trying very clearly to establish something called the Ummah, or the International Islamic Community. Now, in doing so, they have become this magnet, and they produce a magnetism, in fact, for a motley crew of personalities. And these people are coming from everywhere. You have Western Muslims, you have converts to Islam, you have locals, you have Baathists, you have socialists, or former socialists, you have the tribes. They're all somehow being drawn in there. And for us, especially in the West, it's important, because if we want to see what's going on inside, we also have to see who's being attracted to something like, the Islamic State. From, through the research that I've been conducting in this regard as well, I also wanted to see about, I had this crazy question in my mind. I mean, which person from Western Europe, for example, there were these 2 girls that left from Austria. They've both been, raped and murdered, basically, in the Islamic State about a year ago. What brings a 15 or 16-year-old girl who lives in an upscale, fully integrated, speaking, German perfectly, actually born in Germany, totally integrated, what makes them want to go and travel to the Islamic State? And, it's not like you don't know the horrors that are coming out of that, because especially, many of the cases, this is happening after, you see the videos, you know what the Islamic State is all about. And so basically you have 3 kinds of Westerners that travel there and stay there and are making their contributions from within. The first one is the very educated, very integrated person, but who believes that Muslims are being either that they are being oppressed or they're being victimized, for right or wrong. We don't know, what their perception is, but or what the reality is. But the perception is that Muslims are being, mistreated in the West, and so they are going to go there to make their contribution. Sometimes the contribution is going to be in a violent way. Sometimes the contribution is going to be as being an engineer or a doctor, and you have all kinds of different professionals that have been also going to the Islamic State in order to make their contribution one way or the other. A second group of people that we find that head over to the Islamic State from the West are those who are less educated, but have a tendency to being, who have had an experience of victimization. And either they've actually experienced some kind of discrimination against them in the West, they've had a bad experience either directly or through their parents or their grandparents, the so-called cult of humiliation, which is something especially in certain types of cultures. And I don't mean a Muslim culture, but some kind, for example, the Barbers, which are very strong kind of ethos of honor and pride. And to see, for example, the menial jobs that many have had has also been a driving force for people, and sometimes to bring their entire families and relocate them to the Islamic State. And then, of course, you have, and we can't discount the fact that in the West are also living Muslim traditionalists, people who may have been happy living, in the West for one reason or another, but inside they were still very traditional in their perceptions, and were essentially waiting for something like an Islamic State to come around, and then they're going to go and try to make their contributions. Now, the point is that ISIS didn't just come out of nowhere. And the idea of the Islamic State, and by the way, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever, it's all the same. The point is that it didn't just pop out from nowhere. And we can't also categorize it, I think, as a regular terrorist organization. A lot of organizations misuse religion. These guys do misuse religion, but it's a product of something else, a strange synergy between geopolitics or geopolitical opportunity and a very, very hard ideological potency. Now, in terms of the geopolitics, I didn't really want to focus very much on it, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it another time. But essentially, it's, the group ISIS, it had a healthy heritage, but the opportunity came for it to extend some kind of control all the way back in 1998. A lot of discussions about ISIS emerging after the American invasion of Iraq are very short-sighted and I think wrong, because in fact the lineage of the organization finds its root in 1998. In 1998 there was an imposed no-fly zone on northern Iraq. The Iranians and the Iraqis had a long-term dispute, and inside of this kind of political vacuum that opens up in this area around Mosul. Now, Mosul is very important, of course, in the Islamic State. It's the largest city, and it's also the place where the majority of their capital came from. But Mosul, if you can imagine, just I think half a year later, after the imposition of the no-fly zone, after Operation Desert Fox, so in early or mid-1999, a group that later becomes a major part of ISIS takes over some 500 square kilometers in and around the city of Mosul. So we're not talking about an ISIS that comes after 2003 or 2004. We're talking about the seeds of ISIS in 1999, before September 11th, before all of this, and before we started to put all the responsibility on the shoulders of the Americans. And it's very important that we break that discourse. ISIS exists before America enters the Middle East in an aggressive way after September 11th. Okay, so we should clear that part of the narrative up. Now, if we think ideologically, and here I think is the key, the linchpin to this whole story. Ideologically, the heritage of ISIS gravitates along one of the branches of Salafism. Now, we also have, everybody discounts any extremist as being a Salafi. Salafis are also very diverse in their way of thinking. And I'll just give you an example, because there was a branch of the Salafis, the early Salafis, that actually believed and sought a kind of harmony between the core principles of Islam and Western values, including science and technology, right? Gender issues, social, economic roles. For example, there was a man named Jamal al-Din al-Afghani who was writing already at the beginning of the 19th century, the 1830s, 1840s, in which, basically what he wanted to do is root out this idea of jurisprudence within Islam, as well as the concept of individual judgment, this ijtihad, which basically gave too much power to the local religious authorities or to the history of religious, let's say, decrees. And so he was trying to turn Islam into something like a deductive approach to society and life. This was a guy who was reading philosophy, and this is one of the first Salafis, okay? So when we think and we discount everybody as being Salafi if they have an extremist view, we need to know a little bit more about what Salafis is. And somebody like al-Afghani, what he was looking to do is turn Islamic texts into clues rather than into truth. But of course, like everything, when you start rationalizing, guess what there is? There's this thing called blowback. We've seen it from the French Revolution to the Romantic period in Europe ourselves, when you go from the rational to, the spiritual and moving into the spirituality. So Salafis also had developed an alternative, a pushback against the ideas of al-Afghani. And, for example, in the end of the 19th century, a man named Muhammad Abdu was arguing against this kind of accommodation between West and Islamic values. He called Western values decadent, and of course, they were un-Islamic. Now, his best students, just to show you the lineage of all this, because it's not as far removed as one would think, his best student was a man named Muhammad Rashid Arida, who owned a bookstore, a small little bookstore in the center of Cairo. And this was a gathering, like a hotbed, for all kinds of anti-establishment movements. And we're very lucky that the presentations in the morning also highlighted the fact that this is the, Cairo is the place where Hassan al-Banna, who's the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, met, and that's your lineage. So Banna is only 1 degree separated from, the origins, let's say, of the radicalized part of Salafism. Now, there's also a very important concept that I want to raise, something that's a guiding point to ISIS and the Islamic State, something that has been accepted by the radical Salafi Islam, which is called naskh, like spelled N-A-S-K-H. I could never dream of pronouncing it properly. But it suggests that the ideas and the writings of early Islam can be superseded by things that come later on. And so you basically, for those who don't know, you have two major phases of Islam. You have the Mecca phase and you have the Medina phase. And the Mecca phase is the phase that tells you about the peace and about the tolerance and about the ideas of, living together. But then you get what's called the sword verses. And the sword verses come out of the Medina phase. This is the phase of Islam which allows you and kind of reinterprets even things. This is why even within the Quran, there are a great deal of contradictions, because you get different parts being added later on. And as a result of this, you get two clear, distinctive phases. Now, of course, if you have to ask yourself, which phase do the radical Salafis choose? Do they choose the one of tolerance and freedom? Of course not. They choose the sword verses of being aggressive against their enemy. And just think about it, the sword verses. It's not the peace and tranquility verses. And so in this way, these sword verses are what guides the Salafi on, to achieve their objectives. Now, but what are their objectives? Of course, like I said, they are essentially a romantic-driven organization. And I don't mean romance like chocolates and flowers. I mean romance in the sense of the return to the mythical state. The return somehow to the spiritual state of being, right? The mythical state of purity of the community. And, somehow to recreate an Islam in the image of what Prophet Muhammad would have wanted. Now, we have precedents for all this that we will be more familiar with besides talking, in hadith or in, Quranic terms. For example, the Nazis, what did they want? They wanted to create the idealized Aryan man and woman. What did the Soviets want? To create the idealized Soviet man and woman. Even the Iranians are trying to create the idealized Iranian man and woman, or Persian man and, Iranian man and woman, and trying to recreate images of Shiism. But in some ways, ISIS embeds all of these plus much more. It's brutal. It's a sadistic organization, just like the Nazis. It's based on socio-economic, socio-political economic regime changes, essentially, right? Like the Soviets did, and it deploys the language and the logic of international Islamic, of international Islam, just like the Iranians. But there's something much more and much deeper to ISIS. It's not only trying to build a territorial pure state, right? It's also based around the principle we call, it's called the concept of the unity of God. In other words, Tawhid, which means you may see it when there's a suicide bomber, or they give their little videos and they show the oneness of God. The oneness of God and the concept of oneness, there's no debate. What God said is what it is. It's literal. There's no other source of legitimacy except God. There's no other source of law except God. That's it. There's nothing else. That's why you can't have freedom of speech within these arenas, because all you're going to be doing is opening up to debate on something that you can't debate about. It's God, and it's God's word. So it's very important for us to keep in mind the way that Tawhid is being practiced and the ideology behind it, because that's the basis of the Islamic State. And you can't engage in a discourse with them because there's nothing to discuss. It's God and that's it. It's over. That's the discussion. Of course, you can, throw some spokes in the wheels. I like to ask the question of maybe I shouldn't say it. It's, haram. No, but, if you wanted to spice up a conversation with somebody who believes in Tawhid, you can always say, if God is the most great being in history and forever and whatever, can God create a stone that he can't pick up? Which is a conundrum, because, if he can't create a stone that he can't pick up, then he's not all-powerful, and if he can't pick up the stone, then he's also not all-powerful. But these are discourses. I mean, they'll just kill you if you ask those questions, because there's no reason. There's the unity of God, and basically that's it. Now, this is producing, and these ideologies and these driving forces are producing a complete confusion also when it comes to the mixture of people who are kind of being pushed into this Islamic State and adopting these types of ideologies. And it's in some ways, you're finding out that in one way or the other, the Islamic State is becoming almost the ideal specimen, like a kind of almost a personification of the state of nature, as found, in our writings of Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. If you think about it, what does he say? That people live in continual fear, danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Of course, if you live in the Islamic State and you're not, an ideologue, I don't think you really want to live very long anyways, because it's a state of terror, essentially. And I just want to explain a little bit about, I'm going to try to qualify that with some of the punishments, just so you understand, the gravity of actions when you, or let's say of punishments if you break the laws. And, for example, if you break any law, the minimum punishment is flogging. So you get hit, usually by a big hard stick. So that's, if you get hit by a big stick, then that's pretty good. You're walking away, with your life still. But your other forms of punishments, when you go up the scale, you can, have pieces of your body chopped off. You can be drowned in a cage. You can be crucified. You can be beheaded. You can be burned alive. You can be chucked off of a building. ISIS has banned cigarettes, for example, water pipes. If you play music, it's unlawful. That's not going to get you thrown off of a roof or drowned, but it will get you beaten. If you gather in public, you could be, in fact, plotting against ISIS, and so you will be punished with, guess what? A good old-fashioned flogging, unless they have even a little bit more, evidence that you've been, for example, talking to the outside world. Because if you're talking to the outside world, guess what happens to you? Beheaded. That's it. If you are talking to Western media, beheaded. If you are, calling your auntie and uncle in London, beheaded. I mean, these people are not messing around. We're talking, of course, information gets out, but, it's usually underground. If you may remember these bloggers, they all get their heads cut off, for getting caught trying to give information out to the wider international community. Theft, by the way, just like in the old days, is cut, you lose your hand if you are stealing. Of course, there's a very liberal interpretation of what theft is. If you ate too much of your allowance, then, or of somebody else's, then it's also regarded as theft. The one that I think is also sitting very negatively within many people's discourses about adultery or homosexuality. For men, they just get thrown off of rooftops to waiting crowds beneath them, and women get stoned to death. Stoning principles have been either you literally get stoned to death, big chunks of stone until the lady is dead, or what they'll do is, if they have several cases, they'll just line them up behind a very big brick wall and knock the whole wall over on them and then just drive over it. So we're not talking exactly about normal punishments. Now, all these punishments are carried out, of course, in public because they're not hiding it. They're not going to turn around later and say, oh, the media is exaggerating it. They want people to know. They, if anything, they are going to display it in very glossy terms. They're going to show exactly the brutality that they're meting out on their opponents because they're trying to scare people into submission. And so you have like a complete ban on the information flows. You have, ban on internet. Most cyber cafes are, monitored. Well, all cyber cafes are monitored, and that's, basically it. Mobile phones are banned. If you're caught, you're also going to be published. Now, here's the clincher, because, I kind of give you this, well, it is a terrible story. It's ISIS, where there's no end, there's no happy ending in all this yet. But the part that's, I think, most dangerous and most challenging for us is the fact of the recruitment of the next generation. Because you have a very clear and specific focus on the youth. It's almost like the Hitler youth, but it's worse. Because you're using them for suicide bombers. They're being used for, for education. They're being trained as young police forces already. And what this is going to entail, of course, is a generation that's completely lost in space, because we can win the war against ISIS. In fact, the international community can march door by door and house by house, arresting and shooting. But to get rid of this ideology, especially as there's this dissemination, not only of the ideas, but of the people, and it's going to be a very hard It's going to be a very hard struggle in front of us, even when the military campaign will eventually come to an end. But this, I didn't want to go through. I don't even know how I got here, to be honest, because I'm not really that interested in ISIS's failures as governance or governing structures, but it's to show you a little bit, at least, of the challenges that are coming from within. And so, of course, like I said, and I promise, and I keep my promise, there are many more questions at the end of this presentation rather than at the beginning, because one of the other problems is how to distinguish now between a civilian and a combatant in this thing called the Islamic State. Because it's not like all these doctors and lawyers, well, I guess not lawyers, but doctors and engineers who went over there, they're not wearing the insignia, they're not off with guns, they're going to kind of vanish into the next civilian population. And then, of course, you have backup plans and contingency plans and affiliates all over the place. So it's not a war that's going to be concentrated in Syria and Iraq, although I guess the major kind of military maneuvers are going to take place there. And we see it, of course, that it's been shifting. And we started off as an Islamist insurgency that became a state. And as the state starts being eaten away at, so what happens? It's becoming a terrorist, or it's using terrorist tactics much more frequently and with much greater effect. And of course, I'm going to wrap up now, but I don't have a crystal ball. I think nobody in here has a crystal ball. We don't know which direction this is going to be going. But what we do know is that this is increasingly a world war for the Islamic world. Much of it is going to be fought and waged between ideas and ideologies that are coming within or from within the Islamic world. But, Europe is not going to be spared in this. And I think that, if we don't develop proper ways of thinking and proper policies for dealing with it, instead of just, very simple discussions about migrants or about the wars in Syria, without trying to identify and address the root causes, both of issues that, stem from Western problems, in which people have an actual drive. I mean, we're talking, there's like 15 or 20,000 converts in Germany alone, for example, who have a degree of sympathy for ISIS as well. So we're not just talking about problems that are happening there. There must be also something that's happening here. And I think that as this kind of World War III is developing, if we in Europe don't start, A, to learn from our past, and B, to see all the dynamics at play here, we are doomed to, the negative repeat of history. I hope I've managed at least to cover a little bit of what I intended to. And it seems like my coffee thing is gone. So I'm available for questions if you have them. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gabriela, Orientalny Ustav. So I have two questions, or maybe one question and one remark. The first one concerns your use of the category of Salafism, in which you kind of toss together ISIS, which is the organization that emerged in war conditions, and even if you say that it was existent in the 90s American intervention in the region in Iraq didn't start with in 2003. There were 2 Gulf Wars before. And you tossed also in this category the movement, the pietist movement, which is very strong in Egypt, which was politically quite quietist before the revolution, but now they're having political parties which are completely legal, so like completely integrated political players. And then you also put in this category intellectuals, Islamic modernists from the end of 19th century who wanted to reform Islam in a way that trying to integrate some Western advancements in science into Islamic ideology. So I know that these guys, they're also called Salafists in a conventional historical narrative, but there was, it's not a correct, there was an error that someone, historical error that someone considered these guys as the same as Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. They have nothing to do with each other. And if you read today Muhammad Abdo and Afghani, whom you mentioned, and Rashid Rida, maybe Rida to a lesser extent, you will see that they sound very modern today. That has nothing to do with ISIS ideology or with the Egyptian Salafis. Another thing, I just wanted to have your opinion. You mentioned about, you spoke about Muslims, about Europeans leaving to Syria to fight, to join the Islamic State. And you mentioned 3 categories, and all of them were Muslims. So what is your opinion about use of so-called European heritage that massively goes to Syria as well? And also, what is your take on the hypothesis which was developed by Olivier Roy in France, saying that basically it's this movement, the migration, let's say, of European youth to Syria has very little to do with Islam. That is basically a result of non-channeled teenage revolt, and he called it Islamization of radicalism, and not the radicalization of Islam. So what is your opinion about that? Thanks.
No, it's great questions. Firstly, I never used the term Wahhabi whatsoever in the presentation, and I don't think that we would want to go down the discussion of the Wahhabi, what it means. But I think that certainly the ISIS does adhere to a form of Salafi, and I don't think. Salafi is ISIS. Salafism is a part of Wahhabi. No, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. It's the Wahhabi. The Wahhabi has adopted parts of Salafism, and it's. Okay, what is a Wahhabi? Let's start at the beginning. Is a Wahhabi a tribe?
No, it's a person.
Yeah, it's a person, exactly. But the concept of Wahhabism, the Wahhabis are going to turn over in their grave if you start calling them Wahhabis. They don't refer to themselves even as Wahhabis. So unless you, and I appreciate your comment, and we can have a discussion about it, but you know, to be able to tell me that there's an ideology that comes from the 18th century that's called Wahhabism, I think you're going to be walking against the wall, because they don't refer to themselves. It's very disparate, and you have very many different ways of thinking that follow afterwards. And I think that Salafism as a point, which has many branches, and of course you're right. If you go back to the 19th century and you see them as being modern, because it was the inability of Islam to adapt to modernity that these people were railing against. But now it's a completely different thing. And I think that it's important for us to kind of also contextualize how ideology has changed. And I'm not suggesting at all that there's one form of Salafism, and I think that there's been many branches of it. And of course, we also have to be very cautious, myself included, in discussing how ideologies have changed. And even though we may be light years behind understanding, you know, how key personalities have changed them along the way. And I mean, you're right, but we also need to be, I think, much more aware of the diffusion of ideology. The United States, I won't comment on that. Of course, the Americans have been involved in the region. everybody's been involved in the region for a very long time, before the Americans are there. You have the rise, of Mahdi's army in Sudan before the Americans even had a ship across the Atlantic. You have big strains within the Islamic world that have been unfolding since, the 7th century. And I don't think that there's ever been a period of Islamic harmony. I don't think we can ever talk about a time when the Islamic world was calm. I think that we've been talking about, the transitions and counter-revolutions that have been unfolding in the region, since the birth of Islam, and long before it, in fact. And in this way, I'm going to bring that into your second point, because it's very important. When you talk about, Westerners and this kind of teenage angst, and you talk about, it's true. Now, in the 21st century, you do have, a diffusion of information, which I think, actually, I don't even know where to start with this question, because the majority of Westerners who go to Syria are Muslim. They're not Muslim. They are converts to Islam. That's a Muslim, as far as I'm concerned. And what you've also found in Europe is that a convert to Islam is going to be more religious than, for example, somebody who's not. So you're not talking about Westerners who go there. You're talking about Westerners converted to Islam who go there to build something new. So it's not like Christians, and it's not Jews, and it's not atheists who are going to ISIS. But that's why I disagree with the idea that it's going to be the what did you call it, the Islamization of I think it's that those radicals who are going over there are already Muslim radicals who are going to build the Islamic State. That's why they're leaving. And you may be right. There may be something sociological about, there's been articles about the video game culture. There's been articles about, how technology is impacting people's minds and, their way of thinking, where violence becomes, very, how can we say it? How they become desensitized to violence. And so when you go to a place that's violent and they're desensitized to it, it becomes an easier kind of drag or draw to pull them in. But I don't know that any of those studies can possibly be completed. You need like a 30-year research study to look at the sociological impacts of those kinds of technologies. We're only now coming, to the point of being able to comprehensively understand how video games affect people's thinking at all. So I'm sure that there's a big scope for research, but I'm not sure that we're there yet.
Are you sure, Mike, that you cannot defend yourself? Mitchell, I don't agree with you in one point, and this is probably partly a repetition of your question. You try completely to detach creation of ISIS and Al-Qaeda from American policy in Middle East. You said that some basic roots of ISIS were established in late 90s. That means prior 9/11 attacks and the American invasion in Afghanistan and in Iraq. However, we know very well that the first American invasion, via proxies, was in Afghanistan in 1980s, and most of the veterans of Al-Qaeda and even ISIS are veterans of the jihadi groups, which were founded, supported by United States against the Soviet invasion and pro-Soviet regime in Afghanistan. So I think there is a very strong connection between the Western and particularly American policy in Middle East with the rise of those radical groups. And one more point to this. Let's have a look. Some 30 or 40 years ago, we hardly heard about any radical Islamic group in the Middle East. Most of them were secular Marxist groups. Most of the Palestinian hijackers of airplanes were Christians, actually, attacking Israel. It was based on not on religion, but on nationalism and some, let's say, revolutionary thoughts against imperialism, against Zionism, and so on. That's it.
The thing is that, it's easy to blame the Americans, but what about the Russians? The reason why these jihadis were fighting was because of the Russians, not because of the Americans. And because if you think that it was the Americans who, inspired the Soviets to invade just so that they can sponsor some Pakistani based insurgents, or safe house, I think that's wrong. I think that the Soviets invaded for their reasoning, and the Americans, using, like I said, they had very short sight, and they set fire to a house that they were in, and it came back and blowback hit them very hard. But I don't think that the Americans are responsible for the rise of these jihadi groups in Afghanistan. I think the Russians are. And I think that if you keep the Americans out and you pretend that the Americans weren't born as a country, you would have still found violence in Afghanistan. And if everything else worked how it was, the Russians would have still invaded them. And so I think that it's very easy, and I'm not pro-American. I can tell you 1,000,001 stories of how the Americans made mistakes and the fact that the Americans didn't have, the proper planning. But to assume that they were responsible for the rise of these, I think is also maybe at the very least you have a shared responsibility. But exactly, you answered in some ways your own question. There was no talk beforehand of Islamic terror organizations. That doesn't mean they didn't exist, because as we've been talking about, the ideology structures were there. We know that al-Banna was already, building up the Muslim Brotherhood. We know, for example, there was Sadat was assassinated by an Islamist. He wasn't assassinated by a secularist. And we know that there has been an undertone within many countries and many communities that had a religious, direction. And this has been going back to the 19th century, to the 18th century. I mean, we were just talking about it a second ago. From Wahhabism, or if you talk about Salafism, these are movements against the Muslim majority rulership. And this has nothing to do with the Americans whatsoever. And it's not to say that the American role in Iraq or in Afghanistan was not destructive. It was destructive. And it's not to say that, the Iranian role in Yemen was not destructive. It was destructive. Or the Turkish role in and amongst the Kurds. There's radicalized groups in all these places where the great powers are pushing themselves, and pushing themselves into the region. Whether it's Britain or Portugal into the Gulf or whatever. But the point is that I think that it's irresponsible for us to say this is the starting point of it and this is the end point. And I think that's, it's much more complicated.
I know it's very important, this historical background and everything, but I want to come back to today because at least this is what we're dealing with. And when it comes to Daesh and the region, especially when you talk about Syria, I wanted to know what is your point of view about the groups which are neighboring Daesh's territories, working and fighting and being armed by certain countries. And we have, for example, Jabhat al-Nusra, who's fighting there. We have even Jaish al-Islam, which is actually coming to Geneva and negotiate. Where do these groups stand? I know Jabhat al-Nusra and Jaish al-Islam can be like standing very far from each other in your analysis, but I want to know, where do these groups and also the support for them stand in your analysis?
It'll really depend on what happens on the ground. Actually, we're very fortunate that one of my students who did, the split between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their possible kind of reconfiguration is here. But I think ideologically, they're not so different from each other. And I think a lot of the problems that you had between those types of organizations, also with Daesh, many of those problems will be reconciled or are reconcilable because they're mostly down, in some cases, to personalities. The end goal is going to be more or less the same. Yes, ISIS wants to build the caliphate. Yes, Al-Qaeda was more interested in the so-called far enemy. Yes, you had a breakdown of, cordial relations between them during the war in Iraq and with the rise of the ISI. But I don't think that their positions are so ideologically opposed to each other as to foreclose any type of cooperation in the face of a real common enemy. Now, you can say that there's a common enemy now. There's Russia in Syria. There's the Shia militias pushing up in Iraq. You have drone warfare. You have Erbil is, on the brink of launching a major offensive against the ISIS-held control territories of Mosul. For the time being, you don't have the reconciliation efforts between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but who's to say, break out the crystal ball, that can't happen in the future. Ideologically, they're not that different from each other.
How come we're not
we are. I don't know why you're not.
No, I mean, how come at least on the diplomatic front, we see the head of the Syrian opposition group, which is coming to Geneva and negotiate, is a very prominent member of Jaish al-Islam. I wonder why the whole world hear about ISIS and doesn't hear about Jaish al-Islam. The whole world hear about ISIS and the whole world doesn't hear about Boko Haram. Why we inflate one and we let alone the others?
Because they cut off Westerners' heads, that's why. And because these are images that get broadcast into our living rooms and we become terrified of it. If I told you that only 15 to 18% of death in Syria comes from the hands of ISIS and the vast majority of murder there is from the regime, we still talk to the regime. You know, there's still negotiations with it. They're dropping bombs on people and they're raping and pillaging the same way that ISIS does. So it's a matter of, you know, it's not that we don't know it, it's just that we're more afraid because they put Westerners in orange jumpsuits and, you know, cut their heads off. And we don't like that. That's why. But Boko Haram, when they start doing that, they're also going to be on the front pages. They kidnapped 260 girls. We paid attention for a week and then it's over because they're not Western girls and they're not being, you know, Western heads getting cut off and broadcast to our living rooms. And it's unfortunate that technology is going to determine what our direction and focus is, but that's it. That's reality.
So it seems there are no more questions or suggestions. We will discuss it later privately, probably, because it's not closed issue for at least from my part. Anyway, thank you very much. I think now we should move to our last submission by Gabriela Özel Volfová, who prepared a paper about the role of women in the current Syrian conflict. Gabriela works at Oriental Institute of the Czech Academy of Science, and also she's a PhD candidate at the Metropolitan University, Prague.
I don't know, can you hear me without a microphone as well? Yes, I'll try without the microphone if it's... Is it better this way? Okay. All right, well, thank you for the introduction. I'm glad that Mr. Tureček added my affiliation with Metropolitan University Prague. I know Mitchell was worried this morning that I'm no longer affiliated, but to my knowledge, I still am a PhD student. I think it was just a sort of editorial slip out. So I'm new to this technology a little bit, so bear with me, please. I hope you can see the PowerPoint, though. I don't know, maybe it's a little bit too light. Anyway, the presentation today I have is on gender and conflicts, and more specifically on how the Syrian crisis affects women on the ground. Now, when Mr. Tureček called me before Christmas, I think it was before Christmas, around Christmas time, that I would like to participate in this event, and this is actually the fourth time I'm participating in the conference series of Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the Metropolitan University. So I'm very glad that I'm being invited to these venues. So when Mr. Tureček asked me, like, Gabriela, you know, you do gender, would you like to talk about women in the Middle East? And I said, of course, I would love to, you know, like. And then he said, well, it's going to be a talk, and then we are going to develop it into a paper. So I know that there is going to be a research paper developed out of this presentation. So having said that, what I'm going to tell you today is basically more of at the beginning of a research on how the war in Syria affected women there, how the roles changed, and how women actually are not only suffering during the war, which is the first thing which usually comes to our mind because of the media and because of this discourse that we have that women in war suffer. Well, of course they do, and I will talk about how they do it specifically, but I will also try to bring attention to how women are actually resisting in different ways towards the war that is going on there for 5 years. And also how women are implied in the violence, which is something that we don't really feel comfortable about imagining. We try to imagine, or we imagine women as peaceful, as the good mothers and the nurturers of the nation and the family, and then those who sort of carry on the right values. But I will also try to show you, and that sort of developed within the course of my research, which is still at the very beginning, is that how women are implicated in the violence propagated by either ISIS. Well, I'm going to talk mostly about women in ISIS. So those are the 3 positions that I'd like to develop today. I had several research questions when I started to open up this debate on women in Syria and women and war in Syria. And the first is that how does the war in Syria affect women in terms of their social roles? In other words, what kind of changes in traditional women's roles in Syria can we perceive because of the war? The second question, which sort of was left over from other questions that I had before, is that how women in Syria respond to the war? And what are the political narratives of Syrian women and the war? I have to say that I'm not going to really talk about the political narratives too much, but the first 2, how the war in Syria affected women and how women respond to the war, is going to be something that I'll try to share with you today. Being a PhD student, we always have to look for theoretical and methodological frameworks, so I'm still sort of there struggling with it. So my take, or my theoretical approach to this problem will be mostly from security and feminist scholarship. I'll try to combine these. I'm not going to go into the details of this now. This is going to be developed in the paper. And that would be mostly to explain and understand the attitude women have towards the wars, how war changes women's roles, and the participation, the motivation women have to join combat wars in different ways, either in camouflage, uniforms with handguns, etc., but also in different ways how they engaged in the war, in the resistance, etc. Research so far has been carried out from mostly media coverage and NGO reports. I have to say that there is not much, at least from the time I had so far to deal with the subject, much academic literature on, well, it's a sort of short term for the period, but there is not so much academic literature on the effects of effects of war on Syrian women. So I couldn't really draw so much on the empirical studies conducted. Of course, there's a war there. Academics need some time to prepare those. So just having that in mind, I've done my research so far mostly from media coverage and NGOs. So I decided to pursue 3 venues when it comes to women and war in Syria, and that is sort of a story of suffering. That is the sort of typical story that you will hear in the media. In other words, women are raped, women are victimized, women are objects of sexual violence or military violence. They suffer from the war because they lose homes and they are becoming either refugees in countries surrounding Syria. And I'll have a map showing you where Syria is located. I'm not sure you know it, but sort of imagining it more, how it looks like on the ground. Also, many women are internally displaced, which means that they are not going abroad to live in refugee camps or in urban sort of small flats, but they are internally displaced within Syria. And I'll give you the numbers on that, and they are quite staggering. Also, women are, there is a problem with trafficking women and with women being sold as wives or as young brides to either ISIS fighters or to men in the Middle East who can purchase more than one wife. So that's going on as well, and it's quite a good business. And I mean, yes, recently I read on the media that many men in Turkey now are actually purchasing these Syrian women because they're very young, they're virgins, and that kind of is quite a good status symbol for them. And they are quite cheap, so It's kind of easy to get second or third wife. But many also are also engaged in the struggle itself. And that's very interesting because when we think about the struggle, and I am not an expert on what's going on in Syria exactly, but reading the literature and going over this different ways women are implicated in the war or affected by the war or involved in the war, is that women fight or women support the regime. They also are resisting the regime. They are also resisting the radicals, be they ISIS or other radical groups. They are resisting those. And there are also the Kurdish women who are resisting, we've heard the stories on the media, resisting the ISIS, etc. So these positions go from pro-regime supporters, and that being, for example, activists, and also not necessarily those who are in the war, but also pro-regime women who, I will show you pictures later on, who are actually involved in security checks, in in what we would call more of a military role. The Kurdish women, again, maybe fascination of the Westerners with the Kurdish women in uniforms fighting. Again, they are also not very peaceful women. They know how to handle guns. They are involved in direct combat. There are many martyrs already of the Kurdish origin. There are also women who support ISIS or who work for ISIS, and I will also show you pictures of that and how they are actually part of the ideology and strategy of the radicals on the ground. So the range of roles that women in Syria now find themselves, they are, for example, because many men are drafted in the military, or they are actually fighting on the ground, or they have lost their lives, their livelihoods as well, their homes, etc., their jobs. They now find themselves as heads of the households, as the only heads of the households who have to take care of their maybe sometimes 3, 4, 5 children. Also, sometimes in the refugee camps, we hear stories of women who are the only, financial. They are the only ones who bring money to the family. They live in small tents or they live in small rented apartments, and they are the ones who actually have to go and find money for the rest of the family, because men are, once they lost their sort of traditional role of the breadwinner, the providing financial means for the family, that is gone, and they feel emasculated. Their power being their sort of traditional power being taken away from them, they find themselves at a loss, and actually it's the women who have to go and perform these new roles. Okay, I think I've covered that. So again, this was sort of to show a little bit of the complexity, because, as I said, when Mr. Tureček called me, I thought, yes, of course, I'm going to be happily talking about the suffering of the women on the ground. But if we talk only about the suffering, that actually shows that there is a certain passivity. If you only talk about suffering and women as victims of war or rape or trafficking or child marriage, etc., that actually takes away some agency that women and strategies that women have to cope with when they find themselves in this situation. So I don't want to deny that they are victims, but at the same time, women have to find coping strategies of their new life situations. And the way they find these coping strategies differs, of course. There is not only one response to the situation. In other words, there is a small note here. There are no simple narratives when it comes to consequences the war in Syria had on the local women. Oops, I switched it over now completely. What did I do? Oh, perfect. Okay. So I'll go a little bit back. No simple narratives. Now, just a few facts about the conflict in Syria. I don't want to go into big detail. But you can just see the conflict started in 2011. It was inspired by the Arab revolutions in the region, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, etc. So now Syrians have been at war for 5 years. And, for example, on average, one Syrian is killed every 25 minutes. And one Syrian is wounded every 30 minutes. So if you think of this course, of the time of the conference today, we started at 9. By the time we end, we could actually make a new head count of how many Syrians either were wounded or killed. And I know this may sound like a cliche, but we don't really realize it. We, as academics, we think it's a figure, but actually there are really people dying as we speak. When I talked about refugees, the numbers are also quite alarming. 4.8 million are living abroad. And this is United Nations. I tried to get the latest data. I hope I have it, as of April. So over 5 million Syrians are living abroad. 7.6 million are internally displaced. So all of these people have lost their homes, have lost their lives, have lost their security and property and even loved ones. Also, there are children being born outside Syria because many women come pregnant to refugee camps, or they are raped on the way, so they also become pregnant. So every 100,000 children are being born outside Syria. The pre-war population was 23 million. 45% out of what I was just telling about are displaced. So half of the population in Syria are not where they were 5 years ago, which is, when I think of it, I can't even imagine this in the context of Czech Republic. That, to me, we think it's over there in Syria, but when I think of it and that would have to happen here, that to me is just unimaginable. More than 50% of refugees are actually women. Why? Men either die in combat, 50%. 40 million Syrians lost their livelihood, and the economy's damage is put at $255 billion, which to me is a lot of money. Well, who fights who in Syria? Again, maybe some of you who have covered it in the morning talks, I wasn't here. Of course, the pro-Assad military, the jihadists, and I have only two, so I know there are experts on the radicals here, so I probably can add, after the etc., I have the Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria, and ISIS. I have the Kurdish rebels, the People's Protection Units, both male and female. There is also a female battalion which belongs to the Kurdish rebels, and the Free Syrian Army, which I understand is to be a coalition of 1,000 armed opposition groups. So that kind of shows you, and that's probably a simplified picture, I can imagine, of the complexity and confusion of what's actually going on the ground. I hope you can see the map. It just shows you Syria and surrounding countries, Iraq on the east, Turkey on the north. On the west, you have Lebanon, and on the south, you have Jordan. Now, why I have that is because, I'm not sure if you can see it, but in the Syrian civil war, it shows in colors. The pink one shows you, for example, which territories are occupied by which fighting units, and that is the Islamic State, and that is, you can't see it very well, but it's a very large proportion. I can show you the maps later on if you're interested. There are anti-Assad rebels, also sort of the brown colors, and you cannot see it. The Kurds are on the north, around, maybe I can mention the cities like Kobani with the territory, with the borders with Turkey, and the mixed or unclean controls, for example, today's Aleppo, etc., other cities. You've heard about the atrocities going on there. So this is just to show you that, how Syria is actually divided, territorial, power-wise, etc., and how women find their ways of coping with what's going on there. Now, about the Syrian refugees, I gave you the total number. Now I'm going to break it into countries. Now, the biggest share has Turkey. It's 2.7 million. I believe I have, again, March 2016. Of course, because of what's going on in Aleppo, maybe there will be more by the end of the day. I don't know. But 2.7 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. In Lebanon, over 1 million. In Iraq, 240,000. Jordan, 600,000. Egypt, 120,000. And, well, I have Europe figures there as well. 900,000 Syrian refugees. Again, this is a map. You can't see it very well. I'm happy to share the map with you later on. But it shows basically what I just told you, where the majority of the refugees are, and they are logically with the neighboring countries, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. Yes, so women in war. As I said, we are not very comfortable about thinking about women as warriors, as war makers, as the ones who join the war, as the ones who are not violent. So there is this general myth, or probably a global myth, that women are not violent. But there are pro-Assad female guards that I already mentioned a little while ago, who are involved in the war towards their fellow citizens. There are Kurdish female rebels. There are ISIS female terrorists. So what's lost in the war is not only the lives and livelihoods and the homes and jobs, etc., and the loved ones, but also the dignity. And because there is a very sort of alarming or considerable problem of rape and forced marriages, which happen as a consequence of the confusion of the war. So these are some of the new, let's say, situations, such as displacement, starvation, rape, forced marriage, that women are actually undergoing. Well, do Syrian women and their active involvement in the war change the perception of what we have in the West as Muslim women, as the ones who are perceived as being passive, oppressed, dependent by their male relatives or by the male members of the society? I mean, does the war in Syria, when we study it in detail, actually alter this Orientalist perspective on what we have towards women in the Middle East? Well, on one side, it confirms it. Yes, women are suffering because, as I said, there are these now commercial marriage brokers who like to have more than one woman, etc. I mean, this being sort of more on the funny side, but it's of course not. On the other hand, because women, as I mentioned already, are becoming very active in the families, they are going out and finding jobs and bringing money to the house. They are now becoming heads of household. And from interviews that I've seen on the internet, they no longer want to go back to the other roles that they had before, where actually they were more dependent on what the man would bring from his job, etc. Okay. So the new roles for Syrian women are refugees, the internally displaced persons, the heads of households, the women guards, the women Kurdish guerrillas, the jihadi warriors, the jihadi brides, and child brides. So this is sort of like a new, in the last 5 years, you would have, in addition to what women were used to do before, these are the sort of new positions, new roles, new circumstances they find themselves in. Now, I told you that I wanted to pursue 3 venues. In other words, the story of suffering, the story of resistance, and the story of violence. I don't know if I mentioned it. Maybe it was the slide that I kind of deleted when I pressed something here. Anyway, so the story of resistance is the one I chose to start with first. And that's just to give you an idea of the diversity among Syrian women civil society political activists. So there are women in Syria who are not only victims of the war, not only fighting on the battlefields, but they are actually members and political activists of many women organizations. And just to give you a few names, there is the Syrian Feminist Lobby, the Syrian Women's Network, the Syria's Women's Initiative for Peace and Democracy, the Syria Women's Forum for Peace, and the last one I put there, the Syrian Women's Advisory Board. Now, all these, well, not all these, but these are probably just an example of this plethora of political movement or political action women in Syria actually try to do. And they don't always agree with each other. Don't think that this is a unified civil society movement. These women some of them are pro-regime, some of them are against the regime. So they don't even have the same discourse when it comes to how they want to, for example, imagine the post-conflict Syria. But they are involved in some sort of peace-building or peacemaking initiatives. The last one was, for example, invited to the Geneva US peace talks in March, the Syria Women's Advisory Board. And then another NGO got totally angry with what the statement they issued because they say, well, you are more pro-regime and, your ideas of what Syria should look like and what women should be, what roles women should have after the war ends is different from what we believe. But this is just to give you an idea of the diversity, even within the civil society organizations. This is just one. I thought I would show you a few videos, but I'm not sure if I will have time. So this is just one filmmaker whose name is Zaina Erheim. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. And she made a documentary, I think about 16 documentaries from Aleppo called Syria's Rebellious Women. This is kind of a poster for that. And she is showing stories of how women are actually involved in the sort of everyday struggle in war-ravaged Aleppo, and how they fight on the front lines alongside with men, and how they are responsible for securing food, vital supplies, but also working as nurses in the hospital, stitching up the wounded, and making sure, for example, the schools open, kids get to schools, etc., etc. So a variety of women's positions. They do relief work, healthcare, runs training centers for women. They're also activists for what they believe Syria should have eventually: freedom of speech, human rights, democracy, etc. The second story was the second venue, or the second story that I wanted to pursue, was the women, the suffering part. In other words, there is an increase in women suffering through not only rape by ISIS, but also domestic abuse, domestic violence. As I mentioned before, when men lose their traditional power within the household, they sort of need an outlet for whom to, exercise their frustration with the situation. And women report that there is a hidden war on Syrian women, and that actually takes place in the households. And that is the domestic violence by the husbands, by the fathers, etc., who feel they are no longer in control of the family as they should be. And their honor is taken. And those of you who study Middle East, you know that the honor is the one cultural norm and value that is not only in the family, but it's also in the nation. And whenever that is taken away by whatever means, then, there are consequences for that. Loss of honor, certain loss of honor. And for example, raping women is not just that ISIS men think that, okay, this is my right to rape women because they are spoils of war, but of course it is a weapon that has been used in different conflicts, and that is actually taking the honor of not only the wife, but also the family, the man, but also of the nation as such. So that comes as a humiliation not only to the woman, to the family, to her husband or to her father, but also to the nation, because women are considered to be the bearers of the good values of the nation, right? The sort of the nurturers of the nationhood, of the good national identity. And that when the rape happens, then actually you exercise a violation of that honor that every nation, or the nation likes to preserve. So women experience increased domestic abuse within the households. Also, there is an increase in the number of child marriages. Now, why? Because, as I talked about the preserving of the honor of the girl, very young girls at the age of 12, 13 are being married off because there is the fear of rape, potential rape, but also because families can no longer support their children. That's why they are selling their children to men who they believe will be financially and economically responsible for them, which is not always the case in the end. Yes, so for example, very often landlords, as I said, the refugees, Syrians don't live only as refugees, but they also live in urban areas. And very often there are stories on the internet or documentaries showing that women cannot even, they sell everything that is in the house to sort of keep going on an everyday basis. So the landlords, they say, well, if you can't give money, give me your daughter. Well, and then, whatever. So abduction, sex slavery, that's another thing, another disturbing or part of this tale of suffering that Syrian women experience or undergo, is this sex slavery. In other words, you've heard of the case of the Yazidi women in Iraq, and I'm not going to go into this. But for example, I will have a little bit more on that. ISIS is very known for, and actually uses ISIS women, their own sort of, I don't know what to call it, comrades, but fellow ISIS fellows, to actually pinpoint in the neighborhood which they take control of. And there I had that little map of the areas which they controlled in the north of Syria. And that actually they know, the ISIS female women know very well which in the neighborhood a woman is sort of marryable. In other words, a girl 12, 13, and they know that they can go into the households, they offer money to the household to pay and say, well, you give me your daughter because I can, use her for my fellow ISIS fighters, and that happens very often, that women are sold and resold among the jihadists, actually. So they are wives, but also they are sort of sold and resold. So this is actually something that I also experience. Well, about being repeatedly raped, I don't even want to go into the details of that. Rape as a weapon of war, I think I've already talked about that. And the story of women and violence. So that's the last part, the last venue that I would like to pursue today. And that is actually, I again mentioned it at the beginning of my speech, and that is the sort of breakdown of assumptions and stereotypes we have as women as peaceful and honorable and sort of noble souls. But actually they are soldiers, they are in the front line, and they are complicit in the violence that is being perpetrated on the ground. Okay. Lionesses of National Defense. Well, this is actually the Lionesses for National Defense is a female unit which is part of the pro-regime defense force. So these are the women who are employed by Assad to secure the capital and to secure the presidency. There are about 800 of them, and they started to be recruited in 2013 to fill the gaps after many Syrian men defected from the army or were killed. So there are now, you can see, I hope you can see, women in tanks, driving tanks, women with new skills, let's say, who can operate a tank or who can operate a big machine gun, right? So I don't know what kind of skills they would be transferable in the post-conflict Syria, but anyway, there are women who can actually do these things, and they do, and they use them. There are the Kurdish guerrilla girls that I already mentioned. They're fighting the ISIS. They are also in full combat force with a sort of war makeup, right? With a camouflage war makeup. They know, you can see them sitting here by a machine gun. They know how to, I have those videos, I don't think I have time for it. They know how to clean the gun, they know how to use it, and they are proud to actually stand next to the man in the force. Now, women and terrorism is I think, a very interesting subject by itself. So I just put a quotation from Anna Speghart, which worked, she's a sociologist, but she works on female terrorists, and she actually interviewed female terrorists in the Middle East. And she found out that there are advantages to using female terrorists. They get media attention more than male terrorists do, and Mitchell already talked about the ISIS and the media and how they're very skillful at that, and so that's something we are fascinated when we see women and violence put together. Women are better able to hide bombs and send messages, money, contraband on the person than men are, and she didn't study only. The ISIS women, I think she didn't do, but she studied Palestinian and Tamil Tiger female operatives who pretended to be pregnant when really carrying bombs, and the Tamil Tigers even devised a female suicide bra in which the explosives were placed in the cups and the detonator wire ran along the place as a usual underwire bra. So this is quite an interesting, strategy of how you as a woman or somebody as a woman can be employed for terrorist purposes and can actually go unnoticed because women would not be suspected of being able to carry such acts. Women can often engender trust more easily than men at checkpoints. So you can pass as a woman, but you can actually carry quite heavy explosives on you. Also, she noticed, she kind of categorized the roles women in terrorist organizations play, and they can be hijackers, trainers, security staffers, etc., etc. What is interesting, seducer and saboteur. So there are many women who are employed by the terrorist organizations who actually seduce a man over internet, over social media. They, sort of have a rendezvous with the aim of, bringing him towards the male members of the terrorist organization to actually get killed. So they kind of devise interesting strategies to be part of or complicit of this terrorist organization. They are also translators. They are also propaganda makers. A friend of mine here and colleague Adela pointed me to ISIS magazine, the Dabik. Probably you're familiar with it. And I just wondered how many women probably are part of that magazine. I mean, I couldn't decipher it from the names, but are actually writing or maybe taking pictures or editing or translating. So all those are roles that we should imagine how women are implicated, if not in actual warfare, but sort of support of the terrorists. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes? Women and ISIS. I think I've covered that. So these are the women ISIS units or the brigades. Again, you see that they also are taught or trained how to carry a gun, how to handle a gun, etc. There is another one. I can't read Arabic, so I don't know what it says. But maybe those of you who can read Arabic, I don't know what it says on the cap, but I don't know. I guess the idea is that we see women with arms. Sex jihad, I think I'm not going to go into it. So I'll just sort of briefly wrap up. My point today was to sort of convince you and myself as well that there are no simple narratives of Syrian women and the war. And that I did through three venues of suffering, resistance, and violence. And there is a fourth one which I didn't have time to develop because, the conference was today. But that is the compliance with regime, with terrorist groups, etc. Syrian women are not just passive victims of the war, and although this is a tragedy which is going on the ground and we should not forget it, this is not the only angle we should be looking at when we talk about the impact of war on Syrian women. Because once we put them into the passive category, then we really take their agency away and strategies, and then it really prevents building some sort of peaceful solutions later on, because you would put women again into the category of the passive, the dependent, and the vulnerable. Women, as I try to show you, respond differently to the war. Those different strategies, those different alliances they make, the different coping strategies I try to share with you today. Women's roles have changed. I mentioned the household, the head of households. Of course, women suffer more because besides losing everything else like men do, livelihood, homes, children, jobs, etc., property, they also suffer rape. Women are equally motivated, however, to defend their home and family, as do men, and in direct combat, which is something I also try to show. And women, we like it or not, join terrorist organizations, become suicide bombers, are violent as well. So this is the sort of narrative of women as non-violent, as not implicit in the war, that I try to deconstruct today as well. So, thank you for your attention.
So, any questions, please, or suggestions? May I have one question? Gabriela, I don't know whether it was also part of your research, but maybe you just noticed in some sources. Is there any difference in pattern between men and women in Syria, whether to migrate to Europe or not, whether maybe men prefer it rather than women who like to stay back, and is there any difference? Or maybe not.
It's an interesting question. I haven't, I'm sorry, I haven't really come across it in the research, but one thing that I came across is that many women send men to Europe because they believe that they are the ones who can actually, earn the money and establish themselves there. And many mothers try to preserve or protect their sons. Like when we talk about the Middle Eastern norms and values, and I talked about the honor, etc. And I like to think that men and women are equal. Of course, mothers protect their sons. Now, I don't want to show like, oh, I can sell my daughter because she's going to be taken care of, but I want to protect my son, so I send him to Europe. I don't want that to be a message of today. But I think when the woman has to choose, she chooses to send the man because, of course, her daughter could experience harassment, rape, etc. on the way. Also, she might have different strategies to sort of take care of her financially and economically. So that might not be a direct answer to your question. I have not come across this, what you're exactly asking, but in terms of choice, for example, men say, many friends of mine tell me that, oh, you know what, we think that there is a war in Syria, but actually look at all these men who come to Europe. Well, there is actually a reason why they come to Europe, because it is not safe for women to come on their own, and also mothers do protect their sons, and they believe that they are the ones who should be starting the sort of, be in charge of the new household, which they are going to establish in Europe, and they can come later on. So this is probably something that I could, comment on at the moment.
If I may add to your answer,
yeah.
I guess it was 2 months ago, almost 2 months ago, UNICEF announced that the the percentage of women and children who are now moving towards Europe have they have the majority. I think it's 70 to 30 or 60 to 40, something like this. They have the higher number, 30% children. I spoke to a spokesperson of the UNICEF about it, and she said that these are the women who, how you said, their men arrived in Europe maybe at the beginning of the height of the influx of refugees to Europe, beginning of summer, and then towards the end of summer, beginning of this year, it started with the women and children. So now the number of those who are coming to Europe are more from the women and children rather than the men.
Okay, I would be interested to see the data, or if you talk to somebody or UNICEF. Okay, thank you.
I don't know if I need a microphone. First, thank you. I think it's a very important topic, but. If we go back, at least, since time immemorial, women have been victimized. Sexual abuse and sexual taboos have been really, let's say, pushed to the limits in wartime. Whether you talk about, the rape of Nanking, or if you talk about the way that women were treated during Nazi Germany, and whatever, women have always been in this way. But especially, there's been, since I guess just in the post-Cold War era, we've become much more aware of how sex is being used in conflict situations. And I'm wondering if we did a comparison between the Yugoslav civil war, and we saw that sex and rape and gang rape and these types of things were also meant to create the polarization of a particular religion or a particular sect. Because then you're having all kinds, not only of the separation of families from their daughters and their children, grandchildren. So it's like a deliberate way to, for example, force a woman to bear the child of a Serb or of a Croat or something along these lines. So my first question is: do we see similar trends in Syria? Are people being raped because of sectarian reasons, as well as for punishment reasons? And my second question, which I think is very important, because it's taboo already to talk about sex in the Middle East, but what about HIV/AIDS? Because if you look at Rwanda, if you look at Congo, if you look at any of these places, Zimbabwe, when you had some kind of civil conflicts and some kind of let's say sexual violence is being systematically used as a tool of war, you also have kind of parallels with increases of sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV/AIDS. So I'm wondering if there's any data on that.
I don't know. I haven't seen it during the time I did the research. It is. I wanted to do the comparison with Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo, Iraq, but I just didn't have time. And I think that's just maybe something to be developed in the paper. I only have the information about ISIS raping Christian women because in their understanding what is legal and right in their version of Islam is that, and they take them as slaves, is that it's okay to rape a non-Muslim slave. So they sort of justify their acts of raping non-Muslim women because they they are first of all slaves because they enslave them, they capture them, they kidnap them, they buy them as well. So then they justify their sexual violence in these terms. I haven't seen studies dealing with, as you mentioned in Bosnia, when that was, sort of drive a wedge into a specific ethnic group, whether this would be, I haven't seen the studies here. It would be interesting to see if this is going to come out. The AIDS I also hasn't come across. I don't know if you know, or you're asking out of curiosity if you know. Okay, I haven't seen studies yet. But of course, I know one thing, that ISIS forces women who they take as their wives or slaves to take birth control pills because they don't want them to produce so many children because they know that they are going to be selling them further on. So they don't want to be stuck with so many kids. So I know that when a woman is sold among the ISIS men, she always has to carry a box of birth control pills so that she is a proof to the other man that, okay, she's not with a child. Because because the way they interpret this in Quran is that you cannot have sex with a woman who is pregnant. To prevent that, they're very moral. To prevent that, they give women a birth control pill. So that's the only thing I can sort of talk about when it comes to AIDS. I don't know anything about that. I don't want to speculate. But it would be interesting that, what's going to happen, what kind of data or kind of stories we will hear later on. I think it's still too early at the beginning. And as I said, all the media is on suffering, but I think this might very well sort of resurface, in very short time. But I don't have more on that.
Any more questions? Okay, so thank you very much, Gabriela. So now I have last 3 notes of the day here. One of them, Gabriela mentioned that one of the products of the gathering today will be research papers. By the way, you can find in your folder a leaflet mentioning or actually promoting first 2 books, which are from a book series, Middle East on Crossroad. Fortunately or unfortunately, these books will be in Czech language. It's just to raise awareness in the Czech public about the Middle Eastern issues. And of course, next publication will deal with the topics which we raised here today. The second, and really I have to repeat myself, before going directly home, you can still go upstairs for some refreshment. So don't jump directly out to the hot and dusty street. So please, we can still have few minutes probably together upstairs. The last thing, well, I would like to thank all the participants of today's conference, especially all our active participants, our guests, especially Peter Wezeman, Fava Georges, who came from abroad. Of course, I have to thank all of you who came, some of you from very remote parts of Czechia or of Czech Republic. This is now a great discussion here, whether we should call ourselves Czechia or not. So you understand me definitely, all of you. So thank you very much for your questions, for your presence here. I hope it will bring you also some new thoughts about how to deal with Middle Eastern issues in the future. And the last thank is going to Lenka from the IRS department, who helped a lot with the preparations of our gathering here, and also to our 3 student volunteers, Adela, Adriana, and Maria. Thank you very much. Enjoy first some coffee and then your weekends. Thank you. See you.